How does one describe loneliness? How does one describe pain? How does one describe shame? How do I share that with the world?
Imagine if someone, just because of who you were, something that you couldn't change about yourself, they would take your child away at the age of 5. Your child would be taught to be ashamed of everything that you value in your life. Those teachings that are sacred to your family. They would be told that from the day they arrive, they have to speak a different language. They have to believe in a different God.
I was sexually abused at that school. This is what happened to me in that school. And now we're looking for ways on how we can share that with the world and release it.
Why didn't we stand up? Like, these were little children being physically, sexually abused, neglected, spiritually abused, and in some cases they were dying and they were actually murdered. And we knew about it as a public.
Right now we're just going up one of the many halls and flight of stairs that the children used to go up to the 4th floor here. And this is one of the sections that is still going to be renovated at some point, but it's probably an area that is still pretty much in its original state. This was one of the areas right here. So right now we're looking at the junior boys dormitory. So here is where you can imagine that this is the area where there were probably like little beds all the way lined up. They have the old showers and washrooms and has a very strange atmosphere. This area here and here is more of the other part of the dormitory, and it has been utilized for a classroom since, and a very old chalkboard still hanging up. So imagine a child, a young child, you know, shorter than this window, pulling something up or stepping onto something, wanting to look out here to find their parents, to find their siblings, to find family that they were taken from and the way of life that they once knew. And to be on this side of the walls, this side of the window, to know that they can't leave and that everything that they once knew, they weren't allowed to speak of it. They weren't allowed to use their language. They had to speak another language that was not their first language. It was taken from them.
تعود هذه القبور التي لا تحمل علامات لأطفال السكان الأصليين، ويعتقد أن بعضهم لم يتجاوز عمر 3 سنوات، طلاب في نظام المدارس الداخلية الذي مولته الحكومة الكندية. تهدف هذه المدارس إلى القضاء على ثقافة ولغات السكان الأصليين في البلاد.
Some schools were notorious, absolutely notorious. They had people in them who were just straight up pedophiles. no other way you could describe these people who were doing horrendous things to little children, little boys, little girls. And a few of those people have been brought to court and tried and found guilty and are serving time. But for a lot of them, the people had already passed away.
تجدد الاهتمام العالمي بعد اكتشاف هذا الفصل المخزي من التاريخ الكندي، وترك جروحا عميقة في مئات المجتمعات، وأثار مطالب جديدة بالعدالة تستهدف الحكومة والكنائس التي كانت تديرها لعقود من الزمن.
The underlying purpose of those schools remained to assimilate indigenous people. So even if all those pedophiles had been plucked out of it, and even if the schools had been, places where there was no abuse, their purpose was still culturally abusive. The idea was to strip the Indian out of the child and turn them into a white person, right? They'd have dark skin, but they would think and act like a white person, and then they could be integrated into an inherently racist society at the bottom rungs. So you can imagine for indigenous people, God, so say you went to residential school, you suffered sexual abuse, and now the government is saying your child has to go there, and you're only going to see them once or twice a year probably.
نقل أكثر من 150 ألف طفل قسرا من منازلهم بين عامي 1883 و 1998، ووضعوا في مدارس داخلية بعيدة، حيث كان التركيز على العمل اليدوي والتعليم الديني والاستيعاب الثقافي. تقول لجنة الحقيقة والمصالحة التي شكلتها كندا للتحقيق في هذه المدارس أن هدف النظام كان الإبادة الجماعية الثقافية. كانت وصمة عار تبقى في ظلال تاريخ كندا لعقود، ولكن العدد المتزايد من المقابر التي لا تحمل الشواهد يشير إلى شيء أكثر قتامة. تم التعرف على أكثر من 1300 قبر باستخدام رادار يخترق الأرض في 4 مدارس فقط من أصل 139 مدرسة داخلية على مستوى البلاد. حتى الآن العدد الرسمي للأطفال الذين ماتوا في المدارس هو 4120 طفل، ولكن كثيرين فقدوا حياتهم في هذا النظام التعليمي الذي مولته الحكومة.
And then we set in with the abuse and the neglect. And more of them would die in those schools than a soldier would in the Second World War. The chances of dying were higher. It doesn't take much for Canadians to understand the gravity of what happened here.
طوال تاريخ النظام الذي يزيد عن 100 عام، أصدر مفتشو المدارس والمسؤولين الطبيين وممثلين السكان الأصليين تحذيرات متكررة حول الظروف غير الصحية وغير الإنسانية في تلك المدارس. الافتقار إلى الرعاية الطبية والاكتظاظ والمباني المتداعية والطعام السيء والتدفئة والتهوئة غير الكافية ليست سوى عدد قليل من الظروف المروعة التي عاشها الأطفال. كان نظاما تم تمويله وإنشاؤه من قبل الحكومة الكندية، نظام تسلطي على الناس، نظام لا ينبغي أن يعانيه أي مجتمع، نظام نجا منه السكان الأصليين بالرغم من الصعاب.
We have to take pride in the fact that our ancestors, our elders, people that attended residential school, actually survived, and they're passing that legacy on to us.
I'm going to turn my light on again. I want to be seen. I want to be heard. I want to be loved. Stand up. Stand up.
لما يقرب من 100 عام وصلت مدرسة كاملوبس الداخلية مهمتها لاستيعاب الأطفال من السكان الأوائل في مجتمع المستوطنين البيض، وكانت ذات يوم أكبر مدرسة داخلية في كندا. في ذروتها كان هناك 500 طفل. بين 1890 و 1969 تم أخذ آلاف الأطفال من منازلهم ووضعهم في نظام كاملوبس. الذكريات مؤلمة وصادمة بالنسبة للبعض. القدرة على رواية قصتهم ساعدت في رحلة الشفاء.
So mom and dad loaded us up in the car and we went to Kamloops. I knew it was going to be difficult because we went into the school upstairs, put into our room, 6 of us. And first of all, the girls were put over there and we were put over here. Then my sisters were taken from the room by the nuns. And then us 3 boys were standing there and we each got taken to our own place. And that's the last time we seen each other till that Christmas. So I knew that things were going to be different. And it was harsh. I had so much fear inside of me, not knowing anybody, and finding a new way of how I can take care of myself.
الحياة في كاملوبس تركت أعداد لا حصر لها من السكان الأصليين يعانون من إصابات جسدية ونفسية وندوب كان لها تأثير عبر الأجيال. لكن لم يكن أحد يتوقع حجم الاكتشافات التي لا يمكن تصورها والآن بدأت تظهر.
They're ugly truths. They're ugly truths that need to be acknowledged. They're ugly truths that have to be brought to the surface. And the responsibility of owning them.
Reaction continues to pour in after the discovery of graves containing 215 Indigenous children was found on a property of a former residential school in Kamloops, BC.
The shock, anger, and sorrow and disbelief was palpable in our community.
You know, my niece reached out to me and she shared with me that every time they see me on the news or they see a post from the Kamloops Now, that it's like a Band-Aid is being ripped wide open every single time because of her parents, her uncles, my brothers, my sisters who attended here. And I know the pain and the traumas that they went through and that they still carry to this day. We knew that through the oral tellings and the oral histories that were passed on, and from the history that we have, like within our museums and from our ancestors, we knew the truths that were, you know, still lingering and still unsettled and still not confirmed.
The survivors had told the stories through their tears about the children unmarked graves. They knew that they were there because some of them had to dig the graves of those children.
كان اكتشاف بقايا بشرية في ساحة المدرسة أمرا مرعبا، لكنه لم يكن كشفا جديدا لأنه كانت قصص الوفيات والاختفاء معروفة في المجتمع. ولكن في شهر أيار 2021 بمساعدة تقنية الرادار الجديد ظهر فجأة الدليل، وكندا انتبهت ولاحظت الأمر.
The government knew they were there. The churches knew that they were there. The TRC spends a lot of time talking about these children unmarked graves. There's over 100 cemeteries. Imagine that. Imagine sending your child, having your child forcibly removed from you and sent to a school where you have to walk by a graveyard to get to the front entrance. There's over 100 of these.
So we walked and listened as she went through. And you know, knowing that it was right there in the apple orchards, you know, even for myself, connected to even from hearing stories from my grandmother, who also spoke about the apple orchards and some of the things that she knew and the things that she heard. And so, you know, it was really surreal. And it was really painful to think that she was speaking of children. And you know, I'm a mother, I'm a grandmother, I'm an auntie, I'm a godmother, and, you know, children. And for her to say there was unmarked graves and the sizes of them and what the sizes had meant and why and where, and it was really hard to really grasp.
When the 215 were discovered, I went over there on the second day, evening, And I couldn't even get close to the school building because of the amount of people parked on the side of the road, wanting to be down there with the people. Even the people of Kamloops not realizing that we had this structure in this valley that did some horrific things to people, and we didn't know anything about it. It was so wonderful to see Caucasian people standing beside their cars crying with their children.
متحدون في حزن وغضب، كان هناك دافع جديد لاكتشاف المدى الحقيقي للوفيات في كاملوبس وخارجها.
Indigenous communities all across Canada now for the past year have been launching investigations into unmarked graves around the sites of former residential schools. This is something that is long overdue in terms of the research that needs to be done into this. These are marginalized children, and when deaths occurred at these residential schools, it did not result in the kinds of inquiries and questions that would have happened at a public school where there were non-Indigenous children.
لكن القبور التي لا تحمل شواهد ليست سوى جزء من القصة. آن الأوان لسرد القصة كاملة عن تأثير نظام المدارس الداخلية على مجتمعات السكان الأصليين. واليوم أصبح بعض الناجين مستعدين لسرد قصصهم ومشاركة حقائقهم حول ما حدث خلف تلك الأبواب المغلقة.
This community means so much because it's home. No matter wherever I'm at in this world, it's always good to come home. And if you ask any Indian person about where home is, it's the place that they were born in and raised. Who is Harvey Matthew McLeod? To the government, I'm 69700222101. That's how they know who I am. You don't even know me by my name. That's a number that's how they identify me. When we send in records and reports, that's how they record me. So I'm a number.
كان الرئيس هارفي ماكلاود طالبا في مدرسة كاملوبس الداخلية، وكانت محنة قضى حياته في محاولة التصالح معها.
That was one of the things that was really difficult for me, was to be seen. Because what happened in residential school, for the priest to come into the classroom and say, Harvey Matthew McLeod, come with me, and me thinking I did something wrong and going with him and being abused, and it happening the second time. I knew what was going to happen, but I went. Third time. So after a while, I said, I'm going to turn that little light that I have shining on me and turn it off, and I'm going to blend in with the trees, with the grass, with other people, so that nobody will ever see me again and call me out and want to do hurtful things to me. So it took me a long time, and that happened in the last 6 years, that I said, I'm going to turn my light on again. I want to be seen. I want to be heard. I want to be loved. Because when you turn a light off on yourself, it works, and you hurt a lot of people. And I said, I don't want that anymore. I'm a human being.
وبعد المدرسة الداخلية كافح هارفي مع تعاطي الكحول ومشاكل الصحة العقلية، ويقول بأن عائلته هي التي ألهمته للخروج من هذه الدائرة.
I've seen the world from a different point of view, where it really opened me up and allowed this thing to be opened again, my heart, because I had it closed for so long, just to protect myself, and realizing how much I love my children, how much I didn't share with them. I didn't want to hurt them. I didn't want to cause them any pain. But while in doing that, I caused a lot of hurt and pain. And now want this thing to never close again, and to be open to what I see around me, and to really enjoy what we got. This here is special. This here is special. I don't know what the next world is. I'm told that there's another world that I'll go to when I pass, but I want to enjoy this one while it's here. And I'll enjoy the world that I have to go into yet when the time is right for me to go there.
ارتقى هارفي ليصبح رئيس مجتمعه فرقة نيكولا العليا، واختار الوقوف ومشاركة تجاربه مع العالم. ولكن بالنسبة للعديد من الناجين من المدارس الداخلية فالتحدث بصوت عالي ما زال مؤلم للغاية. في جميع أنحاء كندا أثر إرث نظام المدارس الداخلية على عدد لا يحصى من الأشخاص بشتى الطرق.
So when we look at the direct impacts of the survivors, they were stripped of their language or culture. They were stripped of the ability to be the parent, to be able to pass on their language and their culture and those traditional values, and to be the parents to truly make an impact on their children.
They were supposed to love us and hug us, but they never smiled at us. They never gave us compliments. They never hugged us. You know, so when I had my kids, I loved them so much, but I couldn't hug them. What was done to us, I finally admitted that I couldn't even hug my own kids. But I loved them, and I knew that I loved them.
I really thank that my mom never had to deal with her trauma through drugs and alcohol. But that's a lot of the issues of other residential school survivors. Because of the traumas that they went through, the only way to deal with it for them was through drugs or alcohol. And so those our family is suffered.
We as people looking at our own history and saying, it's time to stop being sorry for myself with the hurt and pain and anger that I have about how I was treated, and stand up. Stand up.
اضطر الناجون من المدارس الداخلية إلى الكفاح من أجل معالجة الصدمات والمعاناة التي لحقت بهم، ولكن بالنسبة للبعض الكفاح لا يزال كبيراً. معدلات الانتحار في مجتمعات السكان الأصليون هي ضعف المعدل الوطني في جميع أنحاء كندا. من المرجح أن يلتمس السكان الأصليون العلاج لأمراض الصحة العقلية بمقدار الضعف، وأيضا هناك البطالة وإدمان الكحول وتعاطي المخدرات هي أيضا أعلى حيث يعيشون مقارنة بعامة السكان. ويجب على السكان الأصليون أيضا محاربة نظام لا يزال عنصري في مؤسساته.
People were born generation after generation into racism, and many people received no education about First Nations, Métis, or Inuit people other than government-fed stereotypes, like they can't manage their money, it's they're just growing up to be drunks, and all of this other stuff. And that served to kind of take the public's gaze away from what was clearly, even in 1908, one of the lawyers thought was close to manslaughter.
A lot of Indigenous kids like me grew up with parents who went to residential school, and a big part of it is trying to claim who you are. You know, I grew up, I don't want to say feeling ashamed, but afraid. I grew up afraid of who I was. When I went to school, it was hard to feel like I wanted to be me. I wish that would it be easier if I wasn't Indigenous?
So often the narrative was, but Canada is such a good country. And that's true. And especially for people who have come from other forms of persecution, there's a sense of wanting to not believe that the horrors that you fled are also being perpetrated in some form here.
تم أخذ العديد من الأطفال على بعد مئات إن لم يكن آلاف الأميال من مجتمعاتهم لحضور المدارس الداخلية، وكانت العواقب مدمرة، ولكن بالنسبة للبعض لم يظهر التأثير إلا بعد فترة طويلة في الحياة.
The day I went up there, I had no idea where they were taking me. It was my older sister and I, my younger sister. And they took us up there and left us, and I had no idea what was happening, and I just, because I went down by the fence and I could almost see my home across the river. I'd stand by the fence and cry. You know, you're only 10 years old, you still need your parents. We only went home at Christmas time. It was only time.
It's easier to erase a family identity if the children were far from their communities. So, you know, we see children flown in from the north, children that would take enormously long bus rides for days to get to residential schools. And that was for that purpose, to remove the relationships to the communities.
So if you were on reserve, you would have things like your child could go to school, learn to read and write, they could go to residential school, but at least their child could be educated. You would have the ability to get government funding if you were unemployed. There'd be what they used to call sick and destitute Indian benefits. That later becomes the welfare check. And so later on, government policies are created to create substandard but housing units for Indigenous people on reserve. So these become kind of sad locations that are these little bubbles of colonial control.
What they were taught there was that if they weren't put through the rigor of that education, then they weren't properly civilized and they were still kind of dirty Indians. And so like I said, my mom had 20 kids. 10 of them went to St. Mary's mission, and they were put through the rigor. In 1960, my dad pulled them out, and that's the year that I actually started school. And I started at the day school, and so those kids came home, and I didn't even know them.
أغلقت آخر مدرسة داخلية في كندا عام 1998. بعض المباني هدمت، ولكن العديد منها ما يزال قائم. تذكير ملموس بأجيال الأطفال الذين عانوا وماتوا هناك. منذ اليوم الذي فتحوا فيه أبوابهم في ثمانينات القرن التاسع عشر، تم إرسال 7 أجيال من أطفال السكان الأصليين إلى المدارس، ولكن الصدمة لم تتوقف عند هذا الحد. الآلام والمعاناة تنتقل إلى الأبناء والأحفاد، وعواقب الصدمة بين الأجيال.
Mom vowed never to let her kids be in residential school. So, you know, like my mom is residential school, and I say I'm a second generation residential school survivor because of the traumas that my mom faced. It just carried on with us.
There's so many unanswered questions and traumas, and you know, so many that carry a lot of that trauma today because of the abuses that they went through. And you know, for many, they're starting to talk about it. They're being more open with their families because when you think about wanting to tell your children and your families about the abuses that we're subjected to, a lot of shame went with that. And and having to carry it for so long and, you know, trying to bury that pain as well and how it's impacted the family. Like, you know, they didn't know how to be parents.
Sometimes we talk about them as broken people or that all of us have to heal. But the multi-generational strength they passed down when they were children in those schools, trying to remember just a couple words of the language, and they would say it to themselves at night when no one was listening so that maybe one day they could pass it down to their own kids. We're the beneficiaries of that. So when I think of those children in residential schools, I am one of Thanksgiving is my first piece. And the second is to honor that there is real trauma. That was post-traumatic stress, introduction of sexual abuse, etc. And those are real issues.
Today, people are looking at education and they're understanding the intergenerational trauma that residential schools have created. And so there are now programs and things that are being developed specifically for people who might be second, third, fourth generation residential school survivors. And again, that kind of thing wasn't happening in the past. Before it was, 20 years ago, it was, well, we'll hold a healing event. Come get healed, then go back home and deal with it, right? So I think there's a transition that's happening, and I think it's very positive, and it's not happening fast enough for some people. It's happening a lot faster than some people thought it would happen, but it's moving in the right direction.
اليوم يتساءل الكثيرون كيف يمكن لنظام إبادة ثقافية تموله الحكومة أن يظهر في بلد مشهور عالمياً كونه عطوفاً ومهتماً وشمولياً. الإجابات تكمن في التاريخ المبكر لكندا والاستعمار الاستيطاني الأبيض.
Indigenous people were in the way. they complicated things. So what the Canadian government has this, we used to call ourselves the Canadian Dominion. The Canadian government had dominion from sea to sea to sea, right? So settler colonialism, by definition, sees Indigenous people as a problem because they block access to land and resources. And so residential schools are one of the key components in a strategy that is to transform these people into non-title holders. They should come out of this school, get educated, want to buy fee simple land off reserve, and become enfranchised. And back in those days, to be enfranchised, you had to give up your Indigenous status. So this was all part of a very systematic process to remove people from the influence of their parents and their grandparents and get them thinking in a Western way.
John A. Macdonald, upon the founding of the country, was really seeking an Aryan state. Even if you look at records of that time, the man was considered to be racist. He would use the term Aryan, and that's why he would persecute so strongly members of the Chinese community along with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. He heard about these industrial schools that were being used to kind of house and re-educate and eradicate the culture of Native Americans. And so he sent down Nicholas Flood Davin to do what's called the Davin Report.
يعتبر هذا الرجل نيكولاس فلود دافين أحد مهندسي نظام المدارس الداخلية الهندية الكندية. في عام 1879 أرسلته الحكومة الكندية أن يبحث في كيفية تعليم السكان الأصليين في الولايات المتحدة.
Now, Nicholas Flood Davin returns with a report with recommending that these things be rolled out, and John A. Macdonald immediately thinks this is a good idea, and that is a source of them.
The residential school is a place that was described as an educational institute, a school, right? But that provided very little in the way of education for people. These were tools of assimilation.
They were taken from their homes. They were basically stripped of their identities, their hair, their braids. They were cut. They were basically taught to no longer speak their language and or their culture.
The idea was that the re-education, I call them almost re-education camps, the re-education of these children was to displace their identity as First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children and supplant it with a Christian Western identity. And that's where the churches came in. The churches were deployed to run these. Over 60% of them were run by the Catholic Church, but the Anglican Church, the United Church, and others, Presbyterian churches, those were all involved in the rollout of residential schools.
أغلقت آخر مدرسة داخلية في كندا عام 1998. أعيد استخدام بعضها كمباني إدارية لمجتمعات السكان الأصليين، ومباني أخرى مثل هذا في وادي فريزر أصبحت أطلال.
Residential schools took away children from their families to get away from their culture, get away from their language, took them away from their homelands and brought them to other places rather than a residential school that was in the local area. So basically by doing that, they removed them from their territory. You know, when you think about it, because they're removed from their lands, they're removed from the territory, removed from their culture, so removed from the language, removed from their belief system. And it wasn't just the residential school. You have to think about all the other ways that things are being removed, right? We're taken off of our lands, put on reserves, taking our fishing rights away, our whole, the anti-potlatch law of 1884, all those things are all happening at the same time. So it had a huge effect. And when you look at all those different things happening all at once, that was a huge effect on our people.
كانت والدة نانهاتسي تلميذة في كاملوبس، لذلك كان اكتشاف قبور مجهولة في الموقع أمراً مروعاً بالنسبة له بشكل خاص.
Yeah, so when all that thing happened, it was actually quite hard because in our culture, you know, we grieve and mourn like right away. And to me, and I talked to a lot of my friends and relatives, and that's how most of us felt. It was like those kids died that same day. That's how we felt. Like, so for 4 days, we were mourning, you know, mourning the loss of those children. There's a lot of anger, a lot of sadness, but a lot of pride as well. I mean, you have to look at things. There's negative and there's bad, but you got to look at the good and the positive as well, right? And so we can't just continue mingling there. We have to take pride in the fact that our ancestors, our elders, people that attended residential school, you know, actually survived, you know, and they're passing that legacy on to us.
نظراً لاكتشاف المزيد من القبور المجهولة في مدارس داخلية أخرى في جميع أنحاء كندا، فقد انضم نانهاتسي إلى فريق يعمل لمعرفة ما إذا كان هناك أطفال مدفونون هنا أيضاً.
Yes, that's what we're searching for. The orchard over there, we're not sure. Some people are talking about it, but at the same time we're wondering, you know, we're not going to totally doubt them. At the same time, we need to look into it. We need to investigate. But after the Kamloops thing happened and where they found the remains up in Kamloops was in the orchard. So automatically I think people start thinking, oh, we got to look in the orchard, right? But we're going to look for sure. We have to get down to the bottom of it. So it's a 2 or 3 year, maybe 4 year project, I think, that we're involved in trying to find that.
مثل عدد لا يحصى من الآخرين، كان نانهاتسي على علم بوفيات الطلاب التي حدثت في المدارس قبل وقت طويل من الاكتشاف في كاملوبس.
You know, I think a lot of our people kind of knew about that, just didn't know when it was time to talk about it, right? And then all of a sudden there's a focus on it, and all of a sudden you got ears and you got compassion, right? And people are listening. And I think it's a time where people can open up and start talking about what they know or what they had seen. Otherwise, where do you turn? You know, and you can't turn to the police, you can't turn to the priest.
أدت الصدمة التاريخية للمدارس الداخلية إلى انتشار حالات الإجهاد اللاحق للصدمة بين مجتمعات السكان الأصليين. يقول الناجون من النظام أن الأثر المدمر لتعاطي المخدرات والانتحار يمكن إرجاعه مباشرة إلى المدارس.
So in the end, a lot of us didn't make it in our life because of colonialism and the forces of oppression. So in my generation, I'm alone. I don't have a lot of cohorts. I have a few elders who made it through the residential school. And I have a few of like the younger people, but a lot of them are committing suicide, and they're going before I am.
You know, you've got drug and alcohol and unemployment problems on your home community. The children are being taken away to this place that is undermining your children's faith in you and your parents and their culture. This is terrible. This is a terrible dark stain on our country's history that was allowed to go on, again, because I think the government and the church has portrayed this as a benevolent act of generosity, right? We're helping these children who come from a culture that is incompatible with modernity. We're going to help them make this transition. And maybe some people went with those motives, and as misguided as that motive might be, they might have been sincere in that motive, and maybe some of them were kind people. But there were an awful lot of people who weren't kind, and the system was not designed to be kind.
في الأول من حزيران 2008 بعد 10 سنوات من إغلاق آخر مدرسة داخلية تم إنشاء لجنة الحقيقة والمصالحة. هدفها تسليط الضوء على وحشية وانتهاكات نظام المدارس الداخلية التي ظلت لفترة طويلة في الظلام، وقد تم منح الناجين من النظام منصة لمشاركة قصصهم.
Our goal is clear. It is to accept fully our responsibilities and our failings as a government and as a country.
بعد 7 سنوات من جلسات الاستماع وشهادة الآلاف من الشهود، اختتمت اللجنة أعمالها عام 2015.
Change, of course, will not be immediate. It will take years, perhaps generations. But it is important for Canadians to start somewhere and ultimately to create those tools of reconciliation that will live beyond today.
مع الاعتراف بالفظائع التي فرضها النظام على السكان الأصليين، دعا التقرير إلى حقبة جديدة من التسامح والتفاهم.
So the Truth and Reconciliation comes out with this big report, which was based upon already these Indigenous people bravely coming forward on their own to say, I was abused, I suffered at the hands of these pedophiles and these monsters. And so the general public heard that and said, well, was it really that bad? Wasn't it maybe just one incident? And most of these people were nice people doing what they thought was a good thing. That was the response of the Canadian population prior to the TRC. Then the TRC came out and just laid bare this system. And I think a lot more people came on and said, wow, this was dark.
That's been the hurdle to date for our people, is to try and figure out how can we reconcile in a painless way. Well, that's not possible. There will be some pain. But like a sliver, it's painful till you get it out, and quite often it hurts most when you're taking it out.
We are what we choose to remember, and we are also what we choose to forget. And fundamentally, Canada has to deal with the fact that for a very long time, for 7 generations in fact, there was a program in place that was designed to essentially erase the cultural identity of Indigenous peoples from this country.
قبل التقرير ب7 سنوات عام 2008 اعتذر رئيس الوزراء ستيفن هاربر عن نظام المدارس الداخلية.
Today we recognize that this policy of assimilation was wrong, has caused great harm, and has no place in our country.
لكن الحكومة لم تكن وحدها المسؤولة عن نظام المدارس الداخلية. كانت الكنيسة الكاثوليكية تدير ما يقارب 70% من المدارس. النشطاء يعتقدون أن أيدي الفاتيكان ملطخة بالدماء. بعد أكثر من قرن من إنشاء هذا النظام وبعد عقود من الانتظار حدث هذا.
Me encuentro entre ustedes porque el primer paso de esta peregrinación penitencial es el de renovar mi pedido de perdón y decirles de todo corazón que estoy profundamente dolido.
اعترفت الكنيسة الكاثوليكية بدورها في أهوال نظام المدارس الداخلية.
It's not going to resolve these problems and the legacies that resulted from them, but I think it is at least a change in the tone and something that we can work on to build a relationship in a new manner.
Every year we've had powwows here within this arbor we would have First Nation communities come together from not only throughout our nation, but throughout everywhere across Canada. You know, what I envisioned was having the Pope here within this arbor, and to have him to be pretty much in the center, to be able to be surrounded by all the First Nation families that have been impacted from that residential school and other residential schools, to be able to come here and witness him sharing and listening to the pain and the traumas firsthand from the survivors and what they endured, and how it's impacted them and how it's impacted their children, and how important it is to have change and create that positive path forward, and to truly have him acknowledge what he heard, to give a meaningful apology.
تقف هذه المدارس اليوم بمثابة تذكير بفظاعة لم يكن من المفترض أن تحدث أبداً، ويجب أن لا تحدث مرة أخرى. تذكير بالقمع والانتهاكات التي يعاني منها السكان الأصليون في كندا، ولكن أيضاً تذكرنا بالقوة غير العادية أن المجتمعات والجماعات الهندية حاربت ونجت من عقود من انتهاكات حقوق الإنسان المستمرة. السؤال الآن ليس فقط كيف نصحح أخطاء الماضي، ولكن ما هي أفضل طريقة إجراءات الوقت الحاضر.
People, I don't think, realize that to make change, to make sure that the injustices on this watch are actually fixed, all they need to do is not fall asleep.
We as people, one by one, standing up and saying enough is enough. And to have the strength to do that, to have the courage to do that.
Well, my message to Canadians is, when you see an injustice, don't turn the page, because when the story dies, the children do too.